I've just finished working on the Faith 5 Bible studies that talk about Moses and the Exodus from Egypt. That story is a defining story for the people of faith. The story of how God freed the people from slavery in Egypt and led them to a new land. Good morning and welcome to Word of the Day Thursday, and our word for today is story. Stories are such an important part of who we are and how we understand ourselves. I remember that when I was a kid, I used to love to get my grandmas and grandpas to talk about the stories that they had from their childhood. My grandma used to talk about skiing to school in Finland. My grandpa used to talk about serving in the army as World War I came to an end and being assigned to help with food trains that brought food to the recently defeated Germans. My other grandpa used to talk about working on a fishing boat on Lake Superior. And my other grandma used to tell us stories about the pranks she and her siblings played on parents and neighbors. I don't really remember all of her stories, but I do remember how gleeful she was when telling us how naughty she had been. Our lives are built on the stories of our grandparents and our parents and our own life experience. Our stories help us to understand who we are and what we believe. They're part of the foundation on which we build our lives. Last year I went to a reunion and met a bunch of cousins from my great-grandfather's side. One of my cousins was a young man who had been adopted as a baby, and he never knew much about that part of his family. He took such delight in meeting all of us and hearing the stories of this part of his family. Our faith story is also such an important part of the story of who we are. The stories we hear in our Bible, the stories about faith told by our elders, the experience of faith in our own lives, have certainly shaped who we are and what we believe. Think about the stories that have shaped your life and your faith. What are they? How did they affect the person you became? Now we're in this extraordinary year of 2020. It's certainly been the most challenging in my 69 years. How will this year affect our stories? What stories will you tell about this year? How have your faith stories helped us through this year? For me, I think about those stories I heard from my parents and my grandparents about living through the Depression and World War II. My grandpa risked his life in the 30s to march for workers' right in the trucker strike that was met with violence in Minneapolis. My grandma used to talk of sending her son off to fight in World War II. My parents talked about trying to make ends meet with a growing family on a teacher's salary. Those stories helped me to understand that my family got through those times by faith in God and love for each other. Those stories helped me to understand that I too could get through difficult times. And then there are the stories that have been handed down to me, the faith stories. I think about the stories of how God saved God's people, saved them from slavery in Egypt, saved them from slavery to sin. I think about the stories of how God loves us no matter what. I think of the stories of how God led God's people through times of wilderness. I think of the story of God leading us like a loving shepherd. These stories have become a big part of how I've navigated this difficult year. The stories of faith remind me again and again of how God loves me and how God walks with me. What stories have shaped your year? What stories will you tell your children and grandchildren about 2020?